We deceived people into believing that the Ukraine could defeat Russia, said the new Secretary of State of the United States of America. Think of the magnitude of that statement. Think of the cost of that statement. Although I see Zelensky is claiming that he never actually got anything like the amount of money that the Biden administration actually sent him. 200 billions sent by Joe Biden to Ukraine, 77 billion received by President Zelensky, or at least that is what both of them are claiming. Whether the Americans never sent the money, whether the Ukrainians never received it, will be one of many of the gigantic skeleton hunts that will undoubtedly now begin in the post-mortem on the Joe Biden administration's relationship with Zelensky. I happen to think that both of these people might be telling the truth, that Joe Biden might think he sent 200 billions, and Zelensky might be telling the truth that he only received 77 billions. The question is, therefore, where did the rest of the money go? On that we can agree with Zelensky, who's asking that very same question. If Donald Trump uses the nodal, he can destroy the Democratic Party over the subject of Ukraine. I've been saying that for 2 years now, and I wholeheartedly believe that the scandal that lies beneath the Ukraine war, the bio-labs, the bio-war weapons, the Hunter Biden connection, the big guy, and the sons and daughters, sometimes sons and daughters being the same person, of some of the biggest grandees in the Democratic Party. I'm telling you, if you go and search for the big beasts and what they were doing over this last decade in Ukraine, you will find the mother of all scandals. And I very much hope that the Russian authorities, who will pretty soon be in charge of much of Ukraine, will cooperate as wholeheartedly as possible with the incoming American administration's investigation. But think of the magnitude of Rubio's statement. We deceived people into believing that Ukraine could defeat Russia. Think what that means for the 1 million dead Ukrainians. Think what it means for the families of the 1 million dead Ukrainians who were deceived to their deaths, who were deceived to the widowhood of their wives left behind, who were deceived to the orphaning of their children. Think what that statement means to the tens of millions of Ukrainians now living anywhere in the world that they can other than Ukraine, and who will almost certainly never go back there. So if you and your country are now neighbors of substantial numbers of Ukrainian refugees fleeing the war, say hello to them, because they aren't going back anywhere. They are yours to keep. They are yours to live with as well and as happily as you can. And some of them are very fine people, but others are not. Others will be the transmission belt, just like the Kosovans before them, for a huge spike in drug trafficking, in pornography trafficking, in people trafficking, in weapons trafficking. What the Kosovo was to the Western countries earlier in this century, Ukraine is poised to be precisely that. We deceived people, said Marco Rubio. Think what that means in relation to your own European government. If the United States deceived you, your leaders were fools. If they were not fools, but decided to fool you, then they are knaves. Some countries, unfortunate ones like ours, our leaders are both fools and knaves at one and the same time. But that's not true everywhere. You get my point. When the Americans were deceiving people into believing that Ukraine could defeat Russia, their satrap governments in Western Europe decided that they too must deceive people on behalf of the Americans. And so they did. They deceived people into believing that they must shiver through 2, nearly 3 cold and sometimes hungry winters. They deceived people into believing that they must give away tens of billions, scores of billions of euros and pounds of their public money in order for Ukraine to defeat Russia. But they were deceiving you, as the American Secretary of State has now made plain. They deceived you into believing that you must turn your back, perchance forever, on cheap and reliable Russian gas in favor of expensive and entirely unreliable and environmentally far more damaging LNG from the United States. They deceived you into believing that that was necessary. They deceived you into believing that you had to spend more, much more, on weapons of war and preparedness for war, because they deceived you into believing that Russia was an aggressive and belligerent power whose leader woke up one day with a bad feeling towards his neighbor and, unprovoked, launched a massive invasion of that neighbor, and might keep on going until he had overrun you. These were all deceptions. They deceived you into thinking that your sanctions on Russia were destroying the Russian economy, when in fact the Russian economy was doing very well, thank you very much. The economy that was being destroyed was yours. More fool you for being so deceived. After all, it was not for the want of trying. I told you until I was hoarse, here on this show and on many other platforms. I warned you they were lying, and now the United States government has admitted it. We deceived people, said the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. So if you've got a government of liars and deceivers, if your government works for the biggest liar and deceiver in Washington, Joseph Biden, then question is, what are you going to do about it? Well, the good news is, the signs are that people are ready to wreak a terrible revenge on the centrist political class in Europe, and hopefully in turn elsewhere in the world, in places like Japan, in places like Australia, in places like Canada, about which more in a minute. But in Europe, there is definitely something afoot. As you know, I spent the last few days in Romania and then in Italy. And I can tell you that there are movements in both those countries that turn their back entirely on the pre-existing centrist political class and are looking for something new. What they find, what they choose, might very well not be to your liking or mine. What they choose, what they find, may very well offend your liberal social democratic sensibilities. But blame the centrists and the social democrats for that. For it is their bankruptcy, their willingness to be deceived, their willingness to deceive you and everybody else, that has left the ruling elites bankrupt. Let's start with Romania. You know, it's always been true that democracy, human rights, the paraphernalia of the liberal and social democratic state was just lipstick on a pig. You've heard me say it 1,000 times before. They liked it. They thought it made them look good. They thought that it made them look good in relation to others who had no lipstick, but it was always just lipstick that would be wiped away whenever it was not necessary. It used to be the case that they could fool you, trick you into doing their bidding. But if it comes to pass that you will no longer be fooled, no longer be tricked into doing their bidding, they will play their last card, which is to do and be the very opposite of that which they always claimed to do and be. Romania is just the first, but certainly the biggest example. As you're about to hear from one of that country's top investigative journalists, because the wrong guy was poised to win a landslide election for president of Romania, they merely cancelled the election. They didn't even try very hard to fool you about the purpose. They claimed, a group of judges claimed, who it turns out are not even judges for the most part, a group of the political elite assembled under the title Constitutional Court, though it was not a court, decided that Georgescu, the front runner, the man who was ready by a landslide to be elected president of Romania, they simply called off the election. They said because it had been influenced by the Russians. Now, this guy Georgescu, I've never met him. I don't know anything about him beyond what you already know or can easily find out. I only know two things of real significance to me about him. First of all, he wanted to end the deception over Ukraine. He wanted to stop deceiving people over Ukraine. He doesn't want to be an enemy of Russia just across the Black Sea. He does not want World War III, thinks we should stop going farther and farther down the road towards World War III. Well, I don't care if you call him right, far right, or whether you call him Jumping Jack Flash. I don't care what you call him. If he wants to stop World War III, I hope he wins the presidency of Romania. Whether you like his views on the pre-war history of Romania, whether you agree with him that all this wokery and quackery and greenery has all gone far enough, whether you agree with that or not, is of no moment by comparison with his unwillingness to allow Romania to be turned into a NATO base camp for never-ending, further, and potentially catastrophic confrontation with Russia. So he's all right, so far as I'm concerned. And guess what? The same is true in Germany. You can call this AfD anything that you like. I actually don't care what you call them, and they don't care what I call them. The only thing that is significant in the German election are the parties of the left and right, Sarah Wagenknecht and the AfD, both of whom say enough of this war with Russia. Bring it to an end right now. End the sanctions which are destroying the German economy. So, all these other matters, I shouldn't need to labor this point will be moot if the world goes up in nuclear smoke. It won't matter what your personal pronouns are or your position on Palestine is. It won't matter a damn, because there will be no world and no humanity to live upon it. Which brings me to the last issue that I have time to address. Netanyahu is nothing if not frank. Before boarding the aircraft that has flown him to Washington, flying over jurisdictions, by the way, that are legally obliged to have brought his plane down and arrested him, but that didn't happen. He said, President Trump and I are going to reorder the Middle East in a way that will benefit everybody. Big ambition. He intends to persuade Trump of the wisdom of doing his bidding. And so far, so good. Trump isn't really America first, you know. He's Israel first, you know. And whatever it is that Netanyahu has fiendishly devised for these talks over the next couple of days, be sure that they're not going to benefit everybody. They're not going to benefit the 350 million souls from the Atlantic to the Gulf who live in the Arab world. They're definitely not going to benefit the millions of Palestinians ablaze this evening in the occupied West Bank of the River Jordan. The massacres and mass mutilation going on in the West Bank right now has one purpose only. Its purpose is to try to put the skids under the Palestinian refugees living there in illegally occupied territory and cascade them towards Jordan. Just as the genocide in Gaza had no other purpose than to ethnically extirpate from the land the millions of Palestinians living there. Trump has been blunt. Egypt will have to take them. Jordan will have to take them. And when both said no, he was even more blunt. They will. They will, he said. We do a lot for them. They'll do it for us. The answer to that question will determine whether the entire Middle East will go up in flames. Because any attempt to drive the millions of Palestinians in the West Bank into Jordan will not just require a pogrom of unimaginable scale in the West Bank, it will bring crashing down the puny and diminutive pygmy Hashemite dynasty in Jordan. And it will set the East Bank of the River Jordan even more ablaze than the West Bank. And ditto, any attempt to force the popinjay, puppet president of Egypt will not just collapse al-Sisi's regime, it will create a revolutionary situation in Egypt that will set the world ablaze. So be careful what you wish for, Mr. President. I know that you know that Netanyahu does not have your best interests at heart. Netanyahu has greater Israel's interests at heart, and those interests are not the same as yours, let alone the same as the rest of ours. Well, coming up, have I got a treat for you. It's a history lesson in a very short order on exactly what's happening in Romania. Stay tuned.